Hello and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And we have a special guest today, Meghan Riordan Jarvis. Meghan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are very excited to have you here. I'm going to read your official bio as a way to introduce you to our listeners, and then we'll jump into some conversation. So Meghan is credentials MA, licensed clinical social worker, is a psychotherapist, author, podcast host of Grief is My Side Hustle, a 2-time TEDx speaker, an educator, consultant, and a much sought after keynote speaker specializing in trauma and grief and loss. Her personal experience with grief and trauma, combined with 20 years in clinical practice, inspired the creation of the Grief Mentor Method, an interactive therapeutic process used to teach anyone who is adjusting to loss how to create personalized grief-informed daily practices. She's also the founder of Grieftastic Book Fair and is on the board of the William Went Center for Loss and Healing. Her book, Can Anyone Tell Me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss, published with Soundstrew Media in October 2024. And her memoir about her personal experience with PTSD after the deaths of her parents, titled End of the Hour, published with Zibby Books in November 2023. Welcome.
Thank you. Boy, it's excruciating to sit and listen to someone read your bio.
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
Before we dive in, I want to just give a shout out that we are recording this episode in March. We were actually scheduled to record it many, many weeks ago.
Yes.
And one of your team members reached out to reschedule for very good reasons, because you were flying to California to help the folks there through the trauma and suffering from the wildfires that were devastating that area. And so as Canadians, even though geographically we're very far apart, of course, we very much care about our neighbors to the south. And I just want to begin by acknowledging and I guess thank you just on behalf of humanity for your work there.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, and I mean this not facetiously. I'm in DC also. These are wild days for us.
They are.
You know, I work as a trauma therapist, which essentially means somebody either just went through something terrible and is trying to help prevent the meaning of that terribleness to sort of land deeply in their system and limit their life, or that already happened and they're trying to sort of get that out of their system. And the wildfires, you know, they were wildfires. They were sudden, they were extreme. When those houses were hit by this fire, they were burnt to cinders. It's not like when a building catches fire and like maybe your books are waterlogged. There's nothing left. And the community that was burned, I met a woman who she lost her house. Her husband of, you know, a million years lost his rental property. Both of their sons lost their homes. And she was like 90. And that story is not that uncommon because the area is this very like residential long-term living area. It also housed many, many people of uber wealth who just never on their list of things that they expected might happen in their life, being homeless and needing to stand in line to get, you know, a receipt from FEMA was just never part of what they expected. And in DC, we don't have fires, but we have something similar going on, which is like people have worked for the federal government for their entire careers. And many of those folks opted in as an act of service, you know, and so maybe they could have worked in Ohio and made more money or lived a different kind of life, right? But they did it as a sort of a civic duty for many of these folks. And it's a bit like a wildfire, like they're waiting to be burned or they were burned. Mm-hmm. And sort of regardless of what your politics is, it's a really wild thing to have to adjust to something that devastating in, you know, that landing on you that fast. Mm-hmm. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for, but my husband is English. And so we keep sort of an international perspective of things. And it's, you know, this is a weird time. it's a weird
The
time
weird
for
time.
us. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to just say, from a Canadian perspective right now, there's also a great sense of instability
Yeah.
and anxiety and kind of some of that existential threat that we're
Yeah.
feeling from some of our neighbors.
Yes. Neighbors who will not be named. Yeah, and again, what I say is sort of like regardless of your politics, right? Like,
That's
so it
right.
doesn't really matter how you globally think about things. This is what's happening. People are waking up to emails that are like, you don't have a job anymore, you can't come in, or the Department of Education doesn't exist. I talk a lot about loss, and there's a real difference in your physical reactions when loss is anticipated versus loss that happens suddenly.
Mm,
And there's a real difference between sort of like a menacing threat that you're anxiously sort of trying to anticipate versus there are people who live their entire lives wondering whether or not their dad's diagnosis with Parkinson's is going to end up being inside their system or their kids or their whatever. And a lot of what we're doing is sort of trying to figure out like how do we live with that? Because it's not irrational, and we also can't just make it go away.
yeah. How do we live with uncertainty?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So these are wild times, and again, I think maybe as Americans, or certainly somebody who lives in DC, it's hard to see past my own hands sometimes, but it does help to have my husband's work is also international and has to do with working with organizations that are doing development in other countries. So it does actually sometimes really help to have somebody say like, "Hey, from the north, from the west, from
Hmm. Hmm.
islands away, we see you, and we can see that it's hard. It is hard."
I was going to say that that wildfire image is a great image to portray that broader understanding of what people are facing unexpected. And I
Yes.
think that in the midst of all of that, what you just said too is that, there's a connection of positive things around the world too, that there's a connect, we need to connect to the positive side of our humanity in the midst of all of what is pulling us apart. And I think that's the goal of that too. So thank you for that. It is a wild time. It's a difficult time for
Yeah.
many, many different reasons. So I don't want to lose the hope of our goodness in humanity too that's still there.
Well, and that's the answer to the question when people are like, how am I supposed to live with this?
Hmm.
There's a difference when you're grieving something or you're processing something that's already ended versus something that's continuing, right? Like, how do you manage inside a system where, the threats are to your employment or your health or whatever aren't over? And exactly what you just said is the answer, although people don't always want to hear that right away. It's not, look on the bright side. That's not what we're saying. What I
No,
am saying
no.
is if you are overwhelmed with dread, can you see if you can become overwhelmed with beauty?
Hmm.
So this weekend, I have three teenagers, and I was like, everybody up. And we happen to live in a city that has incredible museums. And we went and parked right outside the Phillips Collection. My daughter had just gotten her license. So that was really funny because my husband and I were in the back seat of the car. And we went and looked at, my favorite kind of painting, which is like impressionist painting in giant sizes. And then, we ate like really delicious cake in the cafe.
Mm,
So, did that change anything? Absolutely not. It did not, except how we felt.
yeah.
And if you
Hmm.
can shift the energy of how you feel, that actually does matter because then you are differently prepared to face the hard things that happen. So I have this thing called finding your five, which is like how do you get to that back to that neutral state when all of the stuff is real? It's not in your mind, it's real. And a lot of it is herding cats, but it's knowing what brings you back to restoration. So for some people that's going to be prayer, for other people it might be exercise, for some people it might be gardening or cooking, but being able to say what is it that helps sort of dump the teapot of negativity out. And for me, David, just as you just said, I really like the internet for this. I really like ridiculous videos of Scottish children swearing. And I love the videos of like families being reunited after separation, or children buying their parents' mortgages, or you can find a lot of inspiration of people doing extreme good and caring about each other also. And so the internet has a lot of evils, but I mean, you can just Google like extreme crying pictures of families doing beautiful things. And you'll get these videos. So thank you for that reminder, because I think we sometimes are like, oh, that's just a nice thing to do after. But I actually think that attitude is life-saving and restorative.
That aligns so well with another podcast episode that we just recorded with Mary Catherine McDonald, who's writing about the hope circuit in the brain, and how do we, and not in a toxic positivity way, but definitely in a very just like the whole breadth of human experience. But where do we find our tiny little joys? How do we activate that hope circuit in the brain to help balance out the fear that we're living with?
It's such an extremely confusing and wildly humbling thing about the human experience. The toxic positivity is sort of like, look, you're failing if you don't feel perky. And we do that a lot with grief and loss in general. I have an article that I wrote, which is like, we need to learn to lose. Like, you know what? Be a loser.
Yeah.
Like, be somebody that knows how to experience loss. Do it.
Yeah.
Toxic positivity makes it sound like, well, and there's some of this in just sort of the self-care industry. A lot of it's geared at women, which is like, well, if you're not able to make it to yoga, you're really not doing what you need to be doing. Like, are you kidding? This woman's taking 4 buses to pick her preschooler up. Like, yoga is not going to help with that. But being able to see those 4 buses on the way home with the preschooler as this magic moment that you're never going to get back and a gift, that reframe does change the experience of being on 4 buses. So being able to say everybody can mine their life for some kind of goodness. I take my dog, my chocolate lab, who is such an idiot. Like, he is a bumbling lunatic. So when I'm in a bad mood, that means I'm like, oh, Winston, come on, man. When I'm able to sort of frame it, I'm like, will you look at this idiot? He's so dumb. Like, he goes in one car door and can't figure out that the other car door is open. Like, we're on this side now. Come on. But I take him to this big field that we're not supposed to walk in, and it's not a dog park. Don't tell anyone. And right now at this time of year with the light shift, it does this thing where like there's a lot of dew on the grass and the sun is coming through the trees. So it's like this frosted, I know I'm not the only person that goes out just for this. It's like a frosted, tiny little thin layer of ice that just melts while we're there in the sun. I mean, I have chills, and it is the most beautiful thing because it's twinkling and sparkling like snow, and then it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband is always like, I'll take him in the morning. I'm like, nope, I'm doing it. Because that kind of thing, it'll make you be able to face the day. It's money in the bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What a beautiful place to start this conversation.
And I was going to say, and the key thing there is it doesn't take away all the other crap that you're dealing with. It's not about laying that over all the other stuff you're dealing with and making it better. It's about capturing that moment and appreciating it for what it is.
This is something I think that grievers really understand, because we're not, grief isn't like a problem that we're solving. It's actually like we become a griever. So it's more like this developmental experience that we're stepping into. And so grievers get that, like, we're not resurrecting your mom. Like, that's not going to happen. And so what I say about art and music and cooking and exercise and spirituality and prayer and being out in nature. I mean, we can find the neuroscience for all this too. So if people don't like the way I talk about it, I'm like, well, I can get very sciencey for you. It's not going to solve your problem, but it may save your life. I mean, that is how I think about it. And I'm really clear with people, like, live music works in 2 seconds for me. Like, if I am really down in the, closest to the stage, closest to the speakers, and to be honest, I mean, there's some music I don't really love, but it kind of doesn't matter what it is. And so knowing what it is that you are able to use as a tool to remind you that your brain, which is kind of like overly heavily weighting the negative experiences because it doesn't want anything bad to happen to you, needs to be invited into the other side of the room to notice, like, the dust motes that are sparkling in the the sunlight, like, does that mean there's dust in the room that maybe needs to be cleaned? Indeed, it does. But it doesn't mean that there isn't actual beauty for us. And it's hard. It's hard to have that emotional shift. But that invitation, if you talk to people and you talk to them about what resilience means, which is a word I don't love, by the way, or you talk to them about how they survived, they will often tell you they were able to form one attachment with one person who seemed to care about them, not always a parent or a sibling, often like a teacher or somebody. And they were able to have these experiences that I would call like sort of micro joys, things that felt like it was above and beyond and outside of their pain.
Yeah. Tiny little joys.
Tiny little joys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Deb Daner calls them glimmers.
Glimmers.
I mean,
yeah.
I think everybody knows what they are, and they do, again, like there's neuroscience that they shift our neurology. What I think is the most important about it is, particularly in my work with people who have had all different kinds of trauma, is that when your body and brain really wants you to focus on the past, to sort of like, look, something bad happened to you before, let's guard against that at all times, you're shifting the neutrality of the present moment, and you're bringing in some of that, like, oof, things are not okay. And so then you're in your present moment, not really feeling like things are okay, even though they are. You're bringing in that history, and then your brain is predicting the future with that negativity.
That's right.
So it's much more like significant and potentially poisonous than it feels like. And a lot of typical therapy is sort of like, tell me about your feelings, which is great, except if you're not going to help someone process their feelings, what you might have done is just sort of ruin the neutrality of this present moment. We need to be able to move that negativity and that horrible experience, the pain of whatever that is. And we need to be able to move that through. And that's actually what I think grieving is. I think grieving is taking the act, the noun of that energy, grief, and inging it, like turning it into a verb. And that's what I think going to music, going to, looking at art, exercising, I think those are the verbs of moving that energy through the system.
And I think I really appreciate that. And I was thinking as you were talking there that that's often, as we know, people are so intent on pulling people out of their grief,
Right.
to this imaginary place of the way they were before. But I think that recognizing that often, somebody's desire to go to visit a museum or to see art or to listen to music in their own way in the midst of their grief is actually part of their grieving in
That's
that
right.
sense that and it may not be those nice things. It may be other things that other
Totally.
people don't recognize.
Drinking and
as
drugs.
being,
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
But there's, sometimes it's that misunderstanding that we're trying to get people to be who they were or back into a world that we think they're into, and miss that person's actions as being their grieving responses, some of which are wonderfully positive and meaningful, and to allow them to do that rather than our agendas in their grief.
That's really well said. And I think, again, if we were able to frame profound grief like that as a developmental experience that we all go through, if we were able to strip out the negativity, like, oh, it's something that shouldn't have happened, rather than, oh no, that happens. I say this to my kids a lot when they're like, my teacher doesn't like me. I'm like, well, you're going to have two years in your school life where like, you're not loving the school year. Like you're in school a long time. You don't get every year is not a good year. There's a lap in life that's hard. And it could be hard because your dad died. It could be hard because you're getting divorced. It could be hard because you're battling cancer. It could be there's some hard laps. And if we stripped away the idea that that was a problem and instead said, well, that's how it goes, then I think it shifts a little bit that component of like needing to pull someone out of it and instead mining it for what those opportunities are. Every single griever I have ever spoken to talks about both the pain and the relief of how relationships shift. When my mom died, I was unable. I did not have the energetic currency. I had no time for the people that I did not really want to be around. I just couldn't do it. And it turns out, and I can reflect on this now, I was keeping a lot of people in my life almost like at a charity. You're like, I'm friendly, I'm nice, there's lots of room at the table, except when there wasn't, there wasn't. And so I couldn't do things like go to a Christmas party. People will be like, oh, it's just 30 minutes. I'm like, I don't know how to explain this to you. This is like you saying that you want me to water ski. I can't do that. I don't know how, and I'm not interested in learning. And for a lot of people, they talk about that as painful, like, God, this friend didn't show up and whatever. But if we just said, like, oh, yeah, and also that's a hallmark experience that every single griever goes through, right? That, David, that before and after that you just described. I often say to folks, the other trauma in my life, other than losing the people that I love, has been having kids. It is a wild and ridiculous notion to be a young married couple and be like, let's overnight, essentially. Like, I think I was in the hospital for 3 days. Bring a mini terrorist, a parasitic terrorist into the house and stay married and stay healthy and stay well. I mean, it's impossible. And so you don't sleep and you don't eat and your partnership goes to hell for a little while. But because babies are cute and we want them, the way that people show up for you is with more joy and like more often. And there's all this other, just on my street alone, when I had my daughter 17 years ago, there were like 2 different mommy baby dueling groups that were like, come join us. No, come join us. If we looked at grief and loss with that same developmental, first of all, we could look at a population. It's going to be people sort of in their late 40s, early 50s who have parents in declining health and, are burying their parents. Like let's get a coffee clutch going for those folks, right? And they're also probably thinking about retirement and launching their kids into the world. And maybe they're, looking at their relationships, but we see that sort of arc, that part of life, as something that is less exciting than the early family days. And so then people are kind of burdened to keep it to themselves. They don't think of it as something that they are becoming new. But you are. When you're grieving, you're never going back to who you were before. You will always be a griever, just like I'll always be a parent. No one ever said to me, so are you back to normal? So are you back? Like, I'll never be back. Even if all 3 of my children moved to Antarctica and never spoke to me again, I'm still their parent. I will never not be thinking about them in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that word, there's words, again, language is so important. But, people talk about recovery. I'm going to recover to where I was. And that idea of, no, it's not about, this is a new beginning. And I love the analogy. And we've often talked of that, of, the analogies of birth and dying and death. And this is not something that you go through a death and a grief and then go back to life the way it was. We find our way. We find
That's right.
life with this grief as part of who we are, and it's not a negative piece. It's, as you say, that the hardest piece for people is the shock that they get that they too are mortal.
That's right.
And the reality that we all experience loss, and yet to see that as a normal piece of life. I'm not talking about, necessarily the way in which the death happens.
Right.
It's normal, but loss is normal. And yet we do everything not to find ways to include that in our growth as a human being and a person.
I have a CEO that I've worked with for a long time. And when he's meeting new employees, one of the questions he asks is, have you experienced profound loss yet? And I mean, I know why he's asking. I mean, his profound loss is something that's well known and sort of publicly known, but he just wants to know, like, when we get there, and his company has lots of supports for that, but like when we get there, is it going to be brand new to you? Do you have some sense of it? Are you going to understand other people when they're coming back to work 3 days after their dad died because they need to be back at work, meaning they want to be back at work? Are you going to understand what that means and how that is? But I love that he asked that question, right? Because we're always like, where do you live? And do you have siblings? Do you have kids? Do you have a pet? But like also, are you grieving? Are you going, is there anything like when we think about it as a developmental perspective? And the other thing to it, which again, you can't say this to somebody that's in fresh loss, is beautiful things come out of profound loss.
We do.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And I don't mean everybody starts like a nonprofit, in honor of their sister. I mean, just like beautiful change and
Yeah.
focus, for a lot of, I have a curriculum, the grief mentor method that we teach. And part of the reason that we teach it is there's 6 core components to it, right? So I just want people to know this is what people end up struggling with. They have to face these 6 elements of their life. And you may not have to do all 6, but everybody that I've worked with has struggled along these pathways. And one of them really is about your identity. Like, who are you in the world? What we normally call that is an identity crisis. But like, what if we just said that there are some times in our lives where what we're going to look at is our identity, right?
I call those the Humpty Dumpty moments.
Correct.
You can't put her back together.
That's right.
So who are we now?
It's part of the hard stuff that comes on that hard lap of life
Yeah.
that year.
Correct. And again, like if we see that and say, sometimes just because we're learning to survive, we can build beautiful things without realizing it. I was journaling. I was journaling every day as part of trying to sort of come to terms with my mother's death, which has been the most profound in my life thus far. And I just couldn't understand it. I mean, I would go to bed every night. And I don't mean I couldn't understand that my mom died. She was 75. She died in her sleep. I'm not an idiot. She died. But I couldn't understand what it was going to mean in my life. I mean, I would say to my husband every night, like, look, I know she died. I get it. I know she died. I just can't believe she died.
Yeah.
Like, I
Right.
can't believe it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I really felt like the center tent pole had fallen in my whole sort of, circus.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what do I even want a circus? Like, who am I underneath here?
Mm-hmm.
And it's 5 years since my mom died, and I don't have all that decided, but I do feel like I have, I mean, one of the beautiful things, you mentioned it in my bio. So when my mom died, I really suffered terribly with PTSD. It was relentless. And because I'm a clinician, I was like, oh, I can't help myself here. I have to get help. So I checked myself into an inpatient facility. You want something to really free you from all the expectations in life? Break all the way down pretty gloriously and publicly. And there are no parameters when you come back. And so there were a lot of things, including, and I've spoken about this before, in my marriage, where it was like, I met my husband when I was 26. We set up our little shop of life early on. And I was really deeply influenced by what my parents' marriage had looked like, which was very traditional. But I'm not a good cook. Like, you don't want me cooking for you. I am not the person that should. I'm also really disorganized. Part of the reason I have Chelsea, who we talked about, my teammate, is because like I can't keep my calendar. I'm not good at that. I've written a bunch of books. I'm good at writing. But there are elements that got reconfigured in my marriage after I came back and said like, oh, well, I can't do anything except focus on my health for a few weeks. And I came back and was like, oh, and also I'm not taking back the keys to that. And I'm also not going to be doing summer camp. I'm done with that. You can do the Tetris of summer camp. And it's been, when I say that to people, people are like, oh, and I'm like, no, that's not what it felt like. It was a really interesting conversation where my husband was like, I'm kind of good at that kind of scheduling stuff. And some of it, God love it, because my kids, got past 4th grade math and they needed a parent home who knew how to do math. And that's not me. So there were some elements of it that maybe we're going to need to change anyway. But I think it's really hard in your life to try to renegotiate things that, particularly when there's other people there who are like, no, I think it's working well. When you need to renegotiate them. And, that's one of the things that happens with grief and loss is that there's a new energy inside your system, new motivations, and you do have to renegotiate. And sometimes people give you a little leeway, sometimes, not always, to make that shift. But either way, it's a beautiful invitation to live with more intention
Mhm.
than maybe you were before. And that hasn't shifted for me since my mom died. It's almost like I have half the budget that I used to have. I'm just like very careful with my energetic pennies, and I'll come home sometimes and be like, oh God, that wasn't worth my energetic dollar. Like it wasn't worth it. I didn't get any cash in exchange.
Mhm.
But I think it's a neat invitation to say to yourself, this terrible thing has happened. Part of what's inside here is who do I want to be on the other side?
And what a great a picture for a good friend or caregiver to recognize that maybe we ought to begin by asking good questions around exploring curiously about who this person now wants to be,
Yeah.
rather than, just assuming that they want to be who they were in that context. People often say, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to be with people in grief. Well, maybe being curious is an interesting way without the judgment, and allowing them to process those
Yeah.
identity pieces. Because you're right, Megan. I think the biggest piece is the things that we're often consuming our time before this grief. Now we call into question and say, why was I doing that? Or
Yeah.
why would I have these people at my table when all they do is take from me?
Yeah.
So I think that curiosity around, and that's what I love about your book too. And I want to get there, is you're very practical. I mean, you've arranged that in a way that addresses those key pieces, but then it invites people to explore those.
Mm.
So I think curiosity and exploration is a part of the way in which we find our way through grief, because truly we've never done it before. I love what you said
Yeah.
about your mother, and I'm the same way. I was a practitioner. My older brother's a funeral director. My younger brother was a clergy. And when my parents died, here we are with our roles, but this is different,
That's right.
right? I mean, I've been with hundreds of people in their grief and dying.
Right.
This is different. And
Totally
so
different.
finding your way in grief is something I have to find my own way in a new way. And so curiosity for me is a way of helping to explore some of those things. But you did a great job in the book to identify some very practical ways in which people often come to that. And I know there could be some, and Julie, I don't mean to take up your time here, but I think we were talking before we come on about the sleep issue, because
Yeah.
I mean, and 99.99% of the people, and their immediate response, of course, is they see their physician and they get a sleep, they get prescribed the pill. And the recognition that, yeah, your sleep is messed up. What do you expect?
So messed up.
Of course.
Yeah.
So maybe you could, and sleep is one of those big pieces. So maybe you could help us explore that a little bit about what you have discovered around that and what you would say to that.
Yeah. Thank you. I built the book, Can Anyone Tell Me, furiously, like on white hot anger. Because when I came out of treatment, and treatment being like every single day I was working hard to get my body back into regulation, I was still going to need to live into the life of being a griever. But what happened for me with PTSD is that I wasn't living at all. Like I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping, and I talk about that's a small percentage of people who end up with that sort of like mental health illness from grief and loss. But I think it's bigger than the world reports on.
Yes, I agree.
It's in the last chapters of the book. It's really important to me that people be able to distinguish, like, when do you need help? Having said that, get help immediately. You do not need to earn help. You do not need to suffer for a certain amount of time. And with everything else, we wouldn't, right? But we do, like women in postpartum do, because they think it means like, oh, we're being a bad mom. And with grief, because nobody really has taught us anything real, we look at TV shows and we notice that people kind of stop talking about stuff after 3 months after a loss. And we have internalized this idea that, like, well, if you're still feeling bad 3 months after, and feeling bad being emotional or physical, again, you're a loser. You are losing at the world. And by the way, people like to say a lot of stuff. One of the things I'm just so vehement about is like, no lying in loss, no lying. There's so many lies where people are like, no one's judging you. Oh, yes, they are judging you. 100% they're judging you. Your neighbor is judging you. Your sister is judging you. And they are judging you based on the things that they think they know. So a lot of what you hear in Can Anyone Tell Me, there's sections in there where it's like, hey, this is normal. Here's the bioscience, neuroscience, whatever I can give you that like grounds it in the actual experiences that have been studied. There's a case example, which is like, and here's how one of my clients went through this. Here's what we did. A suggestion of something to try. It's not going to solve your problem, but we really do need to have a toolkit because you go to your therapist 1 hour a week, but then what about all the other hours in the day and the week?
That's right.
Who's going to teach me how to grieve? Right. And that's what the grief mentor method is that I teach people is it's this experimental process where your sister said hot yoga really helped. Okay. You think hot yoga might help? Go to hot yoga. Tell me how it goes. Megan, what the hell is hot yoga? Why would anyone ever go to hot yoga? It was the worst thing I ever did. Great. Let's take it off your toolkit. Was it just the heat you didn't like? Did you not like the movement? And then we just, as like a duo or a trio or in a group, we come up with ideas of what's going to be supportive of you on this experimental process, right? Where you're going to become a griever. There is also in Can Anyone Tell Me, after you get the experiences for the griever, some things for the supporters. And mostly what I'm saying to the supporter is keep your mouth shut. You don't know anything. Show up energetically. Do not judge because those judgments are just ideas you have. I mean, and I really, really feel strongly about this because I have a bunch of master's degrees, 20 years of experience in the field, and I don't assume my ideas are the best ideas. People's healing is not externally located in some expert. It is inside their own body and they got to figure it out. And so what I'm really saying to those folks who are supporting grievers is this is like adolescence. You are watching usually an adult in real time, trying to figure out who they are again in the world. And I think a lot about when my daughter was in middle school, like one day she would come down like in like Nike athletic outfit. The next day she would come down like in Little House on the Prairie. The next day she would come down all goth. I'm like, you know what? We're just going to go with all of it. I don't need to comment on her and be like, wow, you are really having diffuse styles. She was trying it on. What is going to work for her? So what I think is really important is for grievers to have the core education about their own bodies. Now, there are differences in bodies, of course, and there's probably what isn't in here because it doesn't exist is the differences in bodies culturally. Like we've barely studied grief and loss. Mary Frances O'Connor is probably the person who is pioneering this for us, but it's new. So we don't have the studies of like, and what's it like to be, an immigrant from China grieving in America. Like there are lots of ways in which it's going to be very specific to each person, but human bodies are human bodies. And so in my 22 years of experience, what did people have trouble with? Sleep is what they had trouble with. Eating is what they have trouble with. A sense of sort of who am I and what is life all about is what they have trouble with. They have trouble with their people.
Yeah.
Their people are not doing what they thought they would do, and other people are doing other things. So how do we navigate that? So that, the book sort of takes you through those pieces. With sleep in particular, what folks need to know is it's normal. And for many, many, many people, it does just sort of settle on its own. So like you don't need to add panic to the fact that you're not sleeping, but you do probably need
That's right.
Right? You probably need to make space for it. Right? Like a new mom who isn't sleeping, like, how do we make space for it? How do we make space for the fact that your sleep is going to be interrupted? I have a whole thing on sleep hygiene, which is not anything that people haven't heard before, but it is something that people often don't do. So like, oh, I know I shouldn't take my phone into my room. It's like, okay, but the consequence of taking that phone into your room, when you are not sleeping, everything is harder. So walking back and sort of being like, look, you're asking me why you're fighting with your husband. I'm telling you it's because you're not sleeping. Because your reactivity is higher. You're asking me why you can't get back to your exercise routine or why you are having a hard time, being able to go to work. It might be because you're not sleeping. So a lot of what we're doing is sort of saying like, what do we know about sleep? And I take you through the neuroscience of it, right? Which is like, look, when you go through a trauma, the brain responds in a very specific way. The amygdala enlarge, it cuts off the oxygen. And the way that I image this for people, it's like a mailman who has a typical route. The mailman goes to this little cul-de-sac and he's able to put the messages to the right parts of the brain, puts them in there. Except when the amygdala enlarge, it's like the bridge washes out. And so we can't quite get to the houses where the mailboxes are. But it's the mail and it's important, so he kind of throws it towards the houses. And some of it goes where it's supposed to go, but a couple of houses get letters that aren't for them. And then when the parts of the brain come out and open that mail and they read those messages, they're weird energetic messages, and they send back weird messages. And so really quickly, the body is disrupted. And that is what happens with the sleep, is the messages are not getting where they're supposed to go. And there's multiple ways to look at that. We can look at serotonin. Most of our serotonin is in our gut. So that might mean we're going to look at your food. We might look at the history of anxiety in your family. So do you come from people? It's such an interesting question to ask. Do you come from anxious people? Do other people have anxiety? No, it's just me. I'm the only one. So nobody had like panic attacks or sleeping or nope, nobody. And then they'll come back and be like, I was talking to my sister and we were remembering that like our dad really sleptwalked. My mom's mom, who I never met, my grandmother, she had a breakdown, but nobody ever talks about it. But there is epigenetics, meaning like we hand down inside our genes some of these adaptive behaviors. And so I like to get really curious about it. Like, look, no judgment here. Just who do you come from and what are their past experiences? And then also, hey, did you know anxiety is just like an overrepresentation of one part of your brain? So we take the assessment, we look at it, and we're like, oh, okay, so you're kind of anxious. You also have trouble eating. Maybe you even have a history of an eating disorder. So like your serotonin maybe is not going to be totally simple. And then what can we do to help you increase your ability to sleep? What can we do to stabilize that serotonin? What can we do to be able to, and there's real education there, like knowing that tryptophan, which is something that you ingest, is what creates serotonin. Most people are not going to be able to eat enough turkey slices to like ready, but there are other elements like, okay, while we're increasing your serotonin, you could also do a little bit of exercise, and the exercise is going to increase the dopamine, and the dopamine might help your muscles relax. There's so many interventions. And really what's important is to be able to say, what are we going to try? As part of your grief experience, what are we going to try? And I think educating people about their own bodies, can anyone tell me has a reasonable amount of science? Because I gave it to my 5th grader at the time and was like, do you understand what this is saying? Because I didn't want, as I have had, a clinical book where you're like, wait, so is it the GABA?
Right.
Is the HTP5?
Right.
We don't need that. What we need to know is you can't sleep because your body is jacked up because a bad thing happened.
That's right.
And that's not your fault. How can we help you unwind that?
Yeah.
Can you also speak to, in terms of the body being jacked up? I loved your question. And man, I've experienced this and I hear it all the time, my clients, about your question of, tell me your secret terror since your person died, because it inevitably always comes out that, this jacked up nervous system is now looking for danger. Where's the next threat? If I know my people can die, now I'm looking for, where is it going to happen again? Or is it going to happen to me? Can you just speak to that?
So one of the things I like to do as a therapist is make people feel like they're seen and known really fast. And so there are these things, these universal things that are true about grief and loss. So it's like if we just had everybody in the room and they just felt like they could unbutton their pants and be who they were in their lazy sweats, people generally become afraid, right? So they fear death just touched their life. That is the ultimate fear that there is. It's not going to just go away. where is that fear lingering? And so it usually has two spots. One is my own health or the health of somebody else. And so I just say, who is it? Which one of your kids are you the most afraid is going to die?
Mhm.
And then they'll tell me. And there's usually a reason. That one has asthma, or that's the one that gives me the most trouble. So that would make me feel the most guilt. You know, it's a hard conversation, but also it's a totally relieving
It's
conversation.
a relief. Yeah.
It's a relief
it
to
is.
just sort of say, and they'll look at me like, how did you know that? And I'm like,
Mhm.
because actually we all do it.
Mhm.
And I can be a little bit funny about it also, which is like one thing that you should know about me is if you're 10 minutes late for your appointment, I will be picking out my dress for your funeral and also wondering what songs and whether or not your family's religious. So it's better for me if you can just text me and let me know you're running late. I don't make any apology. I don't say like it's really, I'm a crazy person for doing this. I'm not a crazy person. I've lived through more than one phone call that says the person that you loved is not in your life anymore because they are not alive. So if you're 10 minutes late, why wouldn't that? And again, I take people in with the brain, which is like the brain is constantly scanning the environment for threat. And it only, the part of the brain that does this only has like two coding mechanisms, 0 and 1. 0 is no threat, 1 is a threat. And that part of the brain doesn't know the difference between a bear and like just a weird odor that we don't like. It can kind of only react or not react. And if you have a system that is not able to recover to that 5, right? So 10 is a panic attack, 0, you're asleep. And Dan Siegel gives us this phrase, your window of tolerance is small, meaning your reactivity is high. You are going to go from they're 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late to they're dead. It's just how it's going to be. And there are some ways that we can help you open that window and expand that window, but you're probably always going to do that because it's your lived experience. It's not based in what's happening in this moment, but it's also not irrational.
Mhm.
And you will never convince the brain that it's irrational because the brain is like, but, right? Like people who have loved ones who have, they're the 1% of some medical statistic. Like that's pretty awful because for the rest of their lives, people will be like, well, it's 98% sure. Like, okay, but I lost my dad to the 1% already. So I'm already pretty sure I'm in your 2% that you're saying that it doesn't work for. And that's our brain's learning process. And, so again, we can't talk it out of that. What we normally have to do is sort of show up with compassion to that.
That's
And
right.
instead, what we do is we say, God, I'm really sorry it feels that way. Like, I totally get that it does. I'm not going to try to take that away from you. But I just want you to know, like, and I think about this with my mom, I went down pretty gloriously, but I didn't die from my mother's death. I survived it. And I have a really core understanding of who my supports are. So what would I do if you were 10 minutes late and died in a car accident on the way? Probably I'd survive. How would I do that? I don't know, because I didn't know back then, but I figured it out. And that's the fascinating thing about talking to grievers is when you say to them, can you share the wisdom of how you went from being a young widow to being able to get remarried and start a business? Can you tell me how? What those people say is no, I cannot. All I can tell you is I got up every day and did every day. Can you tell me when your emotion shifted? No, I don't know. I mean, I do remember I laughed that one time, but did I laugh because it was so funny? Did I laugh because I was tired? I don't know. I just know I did start laughing again. Because if I could get people to give me what it was, then we would be bazillionaires because we would just create that, 10 steps to recovery and resilience. But
That's what everybody wants.
yeah. Well, so I created the grief mentor method as a way to give people something. I do think it's ridiculously absurd that we have nothing to offer grievers as they go through this process. I think that is bonkers that you're going to have to do this every single day for years with really maybe the best resource being you go to a therapist's office. And you guys know this, but therapists are not trained in grief and loss. They are not trained in the truth of what it means to, bear witness or sit with someone who is grieving. And so often what they do is they say, tell me about your feelings. But going back to what I said before, telling me about what was it like the day your dad died? So now in my 50-minute therapy hour, I'm going to bring in that really bad day into my present day. I'm going to tell you about it. And there's a really good chance I'm going to walk out of here feeling heard, but worse. And I think and it's on like TikTok all the time. It's just like, just feel your feelings. Like, where did that come from? Feeling your feelings is the problem for a lot of people. Feeling your feelings with no skills is what drives drinking and addiction. Feeling and fighting and feeling your feelings has to have some wisdom and understanding of how to let yourself be in that space emotionally, physically, spiritually, and be able to move that energy through the body so that it doesn't dysregulate you and take over. And that's the part that I feel like we have left grievers to sort of be like, well, I'm so sorry. And you will have to reinvent this wheel all by yourself. And so what the grief mentor method has, which is not, there's elements of it in this book, but it's a curriculum that I teach. The grief mentor method is like when you go to New York City and you sit down in a diner and they're like, you can get Hungarian goulash and Kung Pao chicken and a Philly cheesesteak all in the same restaurant. They're not judging what you eat. You eat whatever you want. The grief mentor method is the same, which is actually on the list of things that we have that people have told me is supportive to them in their grief. There is alcohol. There is promiscuous sex. I don't put promiscuous. What I put is indiscriminate sex. Sex for the sake of sex. So I'm not here to judge. What I do want to look at is how are you defining supportive and like how much does that support carry over time, because there are things that have a really short shelf life and drugs and alcohol have they have a shorter shelf life, let's say, than the hot yoga that we were talking about before. But there may be a time and place for those as you're trying to figure out. I didn't do the indiscriminate sex or the drugs and alcohol, but I did a lot of fighting. I fought with a lot of people. I did not rein in that energy, and I just sort of let people know when I was mad. And that could be the guy at Starbucks, but it could also be like, my relative who also was hurting. So there are ways in which grievers need to be supported in their everyday experience. Mm-hmm. And we haven't done that. There's very little there's curriculum for kids, but there is not a lot of, even in the therapy world, a lot of like, well, here's how we suggest you go forward this week and come back and tell me how it goes. And we do that in groups, and we do it with companies and corporations. Actually, companies are a genius place to be teaching about grief and loss, because companies have all these resources for young families very often. Like, oh, well, we have a daycare center for people with kids, and you have a little bit of extra time, and you can have parental leave, and you can, they love it. They love kids and families. But that executive that they're offering all those resources to in 15 years' time, maybe 10, is going to need all the other stuff on the other end of, not bringing people into the world, but helping people move out of the world. And so, and it really feels different. If you're in a room full of people who you all know sat through, 6 hours of education about what's normal in the body with grief and loss, that's a different room to come back to after you have experienced a loss. It's still all awkward, right? Again, it's like the art. It doesn't solve the problem, but it does sort of energetically support you.
I was wondering if you could comment on crying. I liked what you wrote, page 63 in your book. You said, allowing yourself to cry employs a natural regulation tool. Tears are an energetic expression that help to bring your overwhelmed system back into alignment. If you can allow yourself to cry, do it. Many grievers report not wanting to allow themselves to cry because of fear that they will never stop. And we hear that, right? All the time.
All the time.
But the vagus nerve will ensure that you do not cry forever.
Yeah. I love this. Like, I teach people, if they have kids, I'll say, remember around 4 months, the pediatrician started to say to you, like, look, they can cry it out now. So you don't need to hold them and shush them to sleep. Put them in their bed. They'll cry. It will, the first night it'll be really awful. The second night, some parents are like, no, I'm against this. But in general, It is a truism of children, and it's because of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, it comes from the parasympathetic nervous system, and it's a super highway of information. And so if you get, and the sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets us, when it's an overfunction, it looks like anxiety. The parasympathetic nervous system, where the vagus nerve is, when it's an overfunction, it looks like depression. So I always say to folks, it's like the Chinese symbol of yin and yang. So we have activation in the system, and for some people, if they're afraid of that getting too high, I am super afraid that if I start crying, I'm never going to stop crying. And what I say is, oh my God, you have bioscience on your side. I totally get that. There's so much to cry about. And for a lot of people, when they find themselves crying about, their dog dying, they're also, wow, it's weird. I'm also thinking about my grandfather dying and about that guy that broke up with me. And that's because that's how the brain codes information. It's sort of in file folders. But when they're like, if I start crying, I'm never going to stop, I believe them, except that we have this tripwire in our system, which if you get into too much distress, and people sometimes will have experienced this as kind of like a cloudiness or a dissociative state. But if something is too much, the body has this like, nope, we're not doing that anymore. And what it does when people are crying a lot is it makes you fall asleep. You exhaust yourself and you fall asleep, and it's like a good solid sleep because you really need that restorative sleep. So that's what I say. People are like, I'm afraid to do it. And I say, what do you think will happen if you get in there and do it? And generally what they describe is like an annihilation. Like I'll just lose everything. I'll lose myself. I'll lose my soul. And I'm like, yep, I totally get it. I have also felt that way. So many people tell me that. And the body doesn't usually let us go all the way there. And again, I am not a liar in grief and loss. So I will say there's a small percentage of people, when they go deep into their feelings, they do become psychotic, because there are. So I say that there's a small percentage, but there's nothing about your history. Or I have had a couple of clients where I say, maybe we want you to do this in my office, or maybe we want you to do it with the safety of somebody else. Right? Maybe we're going to co-create some safety for you so that you can cry. So I'm a person, I don't like to cry by myself. My best friend is like shower, car, bathtub, closet. And I am an airport, restaurant. And I have had many people be like, what kind of a sociopath would cry in an airport? And what I explain is I am much safer with lots of people around me. Getting real, because I know that some stranger, if I fell out of my chair, if I started to like fracture in my personality, would at least call the cops. But I don't know that if I'm in a house by myself. Who's going to help me? Even though intellectually I know my vagus nerve would send me to sleep. So that's another question that I ask people. I say, what kind of crier are you? Like, do you like to cry in the bathtub? Do you like to? And when you ask people with the kind of curiosity that David was talking about before, and no judgment, people love to answer these questions, and they often haven't thought about them before, right? And I ask questions like, do you go to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom? And they'll be like, what? Or like, do you eat when you need to eat? Particularly, I work with a lot of sort of high-level CEOs, and they'll crack this little smile. Like, no, I can hold it all day. The reason I'm asking is because I want to know how connected to their body are they?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I say, how do you feel? Where in your body do you feel it? And they have practiced dissociating from even going to the bathroom for the past 20 years, I know I can't really trust them to give me an answer, and that they shouldn't trust themselves, and that we're going to need to do some mindfulness stuff to bring them back into their body for them to even be aware of the grief that's in there. And to be honest, that is the work that I usually have to start with, because aside from crying, like it's a question that I ask people, what do you think grief is? And they'll be like, crying. So if you're not crying, are you not grieving? A lot of men will say, yes, they're not grieving. And when I say, but you spent a year cleaning out your mom's house, you sold off her cars. You remember all that fighting with the bank that you did? What would you say that was? Like, well, it was just a job I had to do. It's like, okay, but that's also grief work. That's grieving. Every time you were doing that with the spirit of your mother who's no longer here in mind.
That's right.
And so it's really important to be able to say to people like, what's going on with you emotionally? And emotions are just these little energetic currents that are unconscious, being able to call them into being as feelings,
Mm-hmm.
so that somebody can say, oh, that migraine that I've had for the past 18 months since my dad died might be, as Meghan said, she thinks it might be. It really might be some grief that I'm not identifying, feeling, and processing through my system.
Mhm.
There's a woman named Nicole Sachs who's really incredible. She has a new book out, and she really focuses on how chronic pain is really just like your body waving to you to let you know that it has some emotional needs.
Mhm.
And I think that's true in grief and loss, that a lot of people come to me and with things that are just all in their head, even though they're literally saying that they're in their shoulder or in their ear or in their pelvis. You know, the doctors are like, I think this is in your head. And what they mean is there is no specific physical flaw that's causing this to happen, but it's not in your head. My throwing my lower back out multiple times when my dad was sick with cancer was not in my head.
Mhm.
But how do we help people, A, identify that, and B, do things other than that so that they don't have to throw their back out? And I use myself as I think a lot of authors and a lot of people who are advocates, you know, we know of what we speak. So part of the reason I wrote these books and part of the reason I talk a lot about this is, you know, I have 2 master's degrees, like like tens of thousands of dollars of additional training on top of that in the field of trauma and 22 years experience working with clients. And still some of this stuff was new to me when I needed it for myself. And that you know, I always say like, God, this makes me want to break plates. Like I feel really bad for myself that I had to learn it this way. And I would like to prevent that from being. There are people who are like, look, you can't really know until you go through it. That's true. It's also true of pregnancy. It's also true of sex. It's also true of puberty. But we do teach people a lot of stuff about that before you do it.
Mhm.
So can you know what it's like to live in France before you travel there? No, but you can know a lot about the place before you get there so that it doesn't like terrify you when, not, I'm not saying France is terrifying. It's a lovely country, but I just mean the differences and the things that you didn't know to expect. Other people can tell you about it so that when you get there, you're like, oh my God, this is what they mean by salted butter. I didn't get it. And now I get it.
That's the piece of, and we just recently did a podcast with Dr. Sheldon Solomon on terror management theory. But there
Yeah,
again, we do that by organizing life not to have to deal with death until we're
correct.
forced to. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden we're into this new territory that we knew was there, but we didn't want to be there. And so we do everything in our life to avoid it. When in fact, it, as you say, and I love the analogy of, you know, if we're going to a new place, there's a lot we can learn about it before we get there, knowing that we still won't know until we're there. But at least we will have some toolkits or information that will help us understand what's normal, perhaps, whatever. That's not a term that I use, but what is something that I can embrace, and what is it that I need to look out for?
The other thing that I think about a lot, that's so beautifully put, and I think about this a lot. I took my kids to some plantation homes when we were in Georgia a bunch of years ago. And one of the plantations talked a lot about like the lily pads and the flowers and the home and the paint and what it takes to keep a gorgeous space. And the other one, when you walked in, was like the first sign that you saw said, every piece of beauty you are about to experience was built off the backs of people who were stolen from their homes and forced to labor here. Like walk in sacred, in the sacredness of knowing. I am stunned. And it absolutely, like absolutely changed our experience in these 2 homes that were otherwise very similar. I am stunned by how many books I read, by how many conversations I'm invited to, you know, witness or be a part of, where people are talking about stress, chronic stress, burnout, things like the Great Resignation, and nobody names grief as part of that. And when you talk about stress, people think you mean you have a hard job. And when you talk about burnout, they think you're not doing good self-care. And when you talk about like the Great Resignation, they think those companies are forcing people to come back into their offices and like Taco Tuesday is not working. But if you pivot that and say, we have, since COVID, experienced profound loss as a global experience. We've offered no additional resources, none, zero, nothing. We just let you work from home. Now you got to go back to the office. We've offered no additional supports. And we are wondering why people are having a hard time. We are wondering why. And we're saying it's because of like the iPhone. Listen, the iPhone may be contributing to people's lack of sleep, but we need to be asking, like, why are they even on it to begin with? What is it that we're looking to disconnect from? So even when I look at political structures, even when I look at increases in racism, I think underneath this is unresolved grief. And that we are not saying it. And so every time I read a book where it says like chronic stress, I write to the publishers and I'm like, could you please, in the next edition, put that the most stressful event in a person's life is the death of a loved one? That's studied, that's well known. Can you add that line so that it doesn't sound the way it sounds, which is that like that person maybe has a bad boss at work? Chronic stress, burnout, even to some degree when we're in the US right now, there's a big movement talking about menopause. Even to some degree, that conversation, which is like women's hormones are out of control. Also, those same age women are burying their parents or moving them into the end of life. So what I appreciate about this conversation so much is the opportunity to just sort of be like, oh, let's spend an hour talking about grief and loss and death and dying, because it's not a problem. It's a universal experience. We will all go through it. And none of us, even all of us, don't have all the supports that we need. We got to build them, and we have to build our skill sets for it.
Well, this has been great, Megan, and I can't tell you how much I've appreciated just listening to you, getting to connect with you, and appreciating the depth of wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you. This was a really lovely conversation, you guys.
Megan, is just as we wind down, is there anything we haven't, I mean, there's lots we haven't said,
We
and
could talk
really,
for a long time.
really recommend that people buy the book. Can anyone tell me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss. Super easy to read. One of the things I wanted to give a shout out about it is it's really hard for grievers to read often,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so I love the way your book is written and structured, because you know, it's your chapters are, can anyone tell me why I'm not sleeping? Okay, great. So I could just open it, read one
Yes.
page, get my answer, close the book. I may never read it from cover to cover, but I can go into it and access the information I need when I need it. Is there anything that you want to circle back to or just give a moment to before we wind down?
I think anybody who's listening to a podcast that has a grief expert on it is probably interested in grief and loss. But I will say there are a couple of books about, one of them is Steve Leader's For You When I'm Gone, which is like a workbook on legacy. I think there are many ways, including wanting to capture the legacy, your grandmother's story. Mm-hmm. Wanting to be able to know all of the, codes to the remote controls. But I would encourage people who are listening to not just have this be a personal experience, to see if you can expand it out so that you are giving the gift of what you care about at this moment. It might be because of your own pain to others. And so that might look like handing them a copy of this book just for whenever. This is just for whenever. Someday somebody is going to need this. When I give this book away, and it's not narcissism, I usually give two. I say one for you, one for the person that you're going to want to give it to, because it's a resource. Mm-hmm. But we are all resources. So one thing I say to people all the time on Valentine's Day, people are like, oh, I've been with my husband since like 1901. We don't do a lot of romantic stuff on Valentine's Day, but I tell people, they say, what did your husband give you for Valentine's Day? And I say, like an updated will and all the codes to all the bank accounts. And they laugh. And I'm like, no, Genuinely,
That's
if he doesn't
love.
give it to me for Valentine's Day, that's what I asked for my birthday. Because what better way to love someone
Mhm.
than make sure that they don't have to panic, that they don't know like where the key unlocks and the keys are to things.
Mhm.
So however you want to enter the conversation, that's what I would say to folks is enter it 2% more. There's a million ways. Listening to a podcast is one way. You don't have to do complicated things, but then share it. Don't just keep it to yourself. Oh, I'm really thinking about death and dying right now. I listened to this cool podcast with this hospice nurse. They talked about this book as a resource, so I got it because we'll all need it at some point. And then reach out to the person that you know that's grieving. Everybody, every time says to me, God, you really made me think about my colleague. Reach out to them. It's not embarrassing. It doesn't matter if you didn't reach out then. It doesn't matter if you never sent a card. Reach out to them right now and just say, I was listening to this podcast. It really made me think about you after you lost your son, and I'm just sending you some love.
Mm.
That's all it takes. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but it does have to be intentional. We can't accidentally become people who support grief and loss. It usually means you got to stretch a little bit.
Love that. 2% more of the
2%
conversation.
more. That's what growth is. 2% more. It's 2% more.
Thank you so much, Meghan.
Thank you
Thank
guys.
you.
This was such a really lovely conversation. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us to continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.